Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Hansen, and I am the Executive Director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society. And we're thrilled to have you here tonight for our presentation on Bears Making History, which also happens to be the Manitou Days theme this year. And I'm going to tell you that this was a tough program for me for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that we have a lot of bears, a lot of white bear folks who have done a lot of incredible things, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Well, a lot, obviously, but it's an interesting, it was a challenge to sort of identify what to include and what not to include. So I'm going to start the program actually with that caveat of you're going to hear about a handful of extraordinary stories tonight, and then we're going to talk a little bit about lots of things, or how we incorporate other stories. And so you'll understand as we go. I hope. If not, then I missed the mark completely. But we'll go ahead and start with some acknowledgments. We, of course, are here at the Ramsey County Library, and we are thankful for that. The programs like this, a lot of their cultural programs, are funded through the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage, Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. So we are grateful for that. And of course for the support of our members at the Historical Society, because without all of our members we would not be able to be here. And that includes our ever-present Dan Jones in the back there, who is our creative director, who is the one recording and doing all sorts of fun things to keep me on task. Both of us probably look a little, I don't know. I was going to say soggy was the word I was trying to avoid, actually. But we've been between Dan doing Market Fest Thursday night, me doing the parade and a little bit of the parade stuff, and beach dance Friday night, and then both of us at the boat show all day on Saturday, which was incredible, but very warm. And I don't mind heat, but it was very warm. So we're both a little, a little off, but that's okay. With that said, we'll dive in and get going here. So our first candidate, our first story that I'm going to share is one that we don't hear a whole lot, but as you can imagine, I have Market Fest on the brain. So Patty Butcher was our first female mayor of White Bear Lake, of the city of White Bear Lake. She was on the city council from 1989 to 95, and then she was actually elected during a special election to fill the vacancy created when former mayor Harry Mayers went to the state legislature. She was sworn in on March 14th, 1995. Butcher's most lasting, she did a lot of things, of course, in office, because when you're mayor, you do. But one of her most visible impacts that still continues is Market Fest. She was part of the crew that brought Market Fest to White Bear Lake. It's amazing because now Market Fest has been happening for over 30 years, and we sort of take it for granted. But we didn't have something like this in the early 90s. And Patty and a number, actually Gwen Florkey, who was the director of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, went out to Santa Rosa, California, and saw something similar and brought that idea back to the community. And so Patty Butcher and Gwen Florkey, I have to stop and pause before I say that, and a couple other folks came together, really. Anna Bahati and Suzanne Worthley and some others came together and were able to get Market Fest off the ground. Let's see if I can flip. And of course, all of you are probably familiar with it one way or another. But it brings anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 people each Thursday night to downtown White Bear, which was a huge thing because really the push at that point was economic development. And the challenge was that we were feeling as a community, as a small town, if you will, we were losing our stores, we were losing our shops, the malls had been around for 15 or 20 years and had really taken shape. At that point, big things were building like Target and Walmart and Venice Heights, and all of those are important elements of our community, or greater community, but keeping traffic downtown, keeping foot traffic downtown was really critical. So that is one of Patty's major contributions and legacies that sort of lives on. And of course, I can't help but you're going to hear a few shameless plugs because you can tell where my brain is this week. But this Thursday, everyone please keep your fingers crossed that it does not rain because it doesn't look pretty right now, but that can change. But this Thursday is the History Theme Week of Market Fest, and so we take over 4th Street and have all sorts of fun things, including our timeline and our replica of the Yankee Girl, which you'll hear about more in just a few minutes, and lots of other history displays, gangster stuff, and all kinds of fun things. So we are excited to be there. We will be at the Armory no matter what, because rain doesn't matter in there, hopefully. Better not. We have a new pieces of roof, so it better not. But next up is Gordon Vadnais, or Gordy Vadnais, as he was typically referred to. Gordy was fire chief for the city of White Bear Lake, for the White Bear Lake Fire Department, from 1965 to 1988. And if you can imagine what was going on in the community at that time, we have some presentations that talk a lot about this, but from 1950 to 1970, the population of the city of White Bear Lake quadrupled. So you can imagine the services you need to provide, including a new library, new police fire stations, new schools, new everything. I mean, not necessarily new, but bigger, more. And this is actually the south side of the lake. So if you can envision, this is McKnight Road going along here, the diagonal that goes straight to the lake. This is County Road E. Up this way, this is actually the part of the airplanes that they were in, so it's not a lake or anything over there. This is Spruce Park, if you're familiar with that area. And so these are all new homes, new developments. Almost all of this was farmland prior to that time. And so all of this area popped up. And Gordy, one of the tasks during his time period as fire chief, and folks refer to him, my husband likes to say that I'm relentless when there's something I want. I like to refer to it as persistence. But some might apply either of those words to Gordy, because he worked very, very hard to get the fire station number 2 at McKnight and County Road E in the early 1970s. And so eventually that did happen. He's also the one who helped us transition and become part of the 911 system. And some folks still aren't super thrilled with him for that, because that caused addresses in the older part of White Bear to be renumbered. So people lost their traditional or their historical address, which my dad was one of them who was not very happy. But it's okay. Stuff moves on, and I'd rather be happy that they can find you if they have an emergency. Another legacy of Gordy's was he was part of the team, or helped the retired firefighters. The firefighters themselves did it, but Gordy, certainly supported that effort of restoring the 1930 LaFrance, the fire engine. And so, if any of you saw the city council and the mayor in the parade on Friday night, that's the fire truck they were riding in. So, again, pieces of these things that stick around in our community. Our next story is Hattie Long. So the Long family, so I say these things and I don't do it on purpose, but the Long family's been in White Bear for a long time. That was not intentional, but sometimes I just can't quite figure out what else to say, so I'm just gonna do it. Anyway, but Hattie was born in White Bear in 1889. She was many things. She actually was a boarder at the Philip Brown House, the historic house that we own and operate and give tours of. And she lived there for over 30 years as a boarder, if you can imagine. The interesting piece is she had so many different facets to her world, but she wanted to write. She actually wrote under a pseudonym of Hattie Hope was her pen name. She also loved geology, like the rocks. And so she was a charter member of the Minnesota Geological Society, and then she organized the White Bear chapter of the Geological Society. But what she's best known for, and really the legacy that she leaves, and I love to talk about this, and a lot of folks, Hattie didn't die until the 1970s, which I guess is a while ago now. But there are folks around who remember her, who were here, were kids or whatever, when she was teaching in town. She was a teacher. And a lot of folks remember her as being very eccentric, being very different, having different ideas and whatnot. And a big part of that stems from the fact that, well, number one, I think she was a fairly gentle soul, and when she was going into teaching, her mother actually said, no, don't do it. You'll be a poor disciplinarian. You won't keep the kids in line. You can't control the classroom, which didn't seem to be an issue for her. But the superintendent of schools, which was a much smaller, I mean, the schools were much smaller then, but the superintendent of schools encouraged her to do so. And so at that time, she actually she started at Washington School, which is what you see there, when it first opened in 1895. She started her education career there. She went all the way through, and at that point you would graduate from, there was no high school building, so it is, however far you went was where you went. And so she graduated, completed her studies and graduated out of that building. Then she went back because in what was essentially the attic of the building, they were teaching teachers training. And at that time, you could take an 18-month or 24-month course and come out certified to teach elementary students. You couldn't do high school, but you could. That's how they brought teachers out. And so Hattie actually did that and went off to northern Minnesota and ended up teaching in one-room schoolhouses, tiny one-room schoolhouses and things in very rustic areas. And she was fine with that. She did well with that for a while. This was about 1912 to 1920 or so. And then she decided she really wanted to get serious about this teaching thing. And she came back and enrolled at the St. Cloud Normal School is what it was called, Teachers College, St. Cloud State today. But that's what they called teachers colleges for whatever reason. And so she enrolled there and attended from 1920 to 22 and came out with her certificate, her teaching certificate or degree. And eventually, fairly quickly, she enrolled at the University of Minnesota because she wanted a certificate, and at that time, the language is horrible, but it is the language of the time. At that time, she wanted a certificate to be trained or certified to teach a subnormal class. And of course, we would call that special education today or many things. But she felt so strongly, and this is where people get a little bit, I don't know, opinionated is probably the word, about Hattie. But she was way ahead of her time in her mindset as far as all of that goes. Her philosophy with students was that she would very specifically would say there's no such thing as a non-reader. Everyone can learn how to read. Some just take a little longer than others. And if you have a dedicated teacher, gifted educator, someone who's willing to put in the time and the energy, everyone can do it. So she ended up actually bringing essentially special education to White Bear Lake. And she taught at Washington School, at her former school for many years. And this picture, I can't confirm that it was at Washington School, although I think it probably was based on things like the window trim and just kind of the more details. It doesn't look like a one-room schoolhouse. But you can see the student, I don't know who it is, but the student, and it's clearly a posed picture, but is a much older person. And there are several, we have letters from different students of Hattie's who she helped through the years, who were immensely grateful for her investing the time and believing in what they could do and bringing that forward. So she also, what I love about Hattie is that she insisted that her classes, that the administration referred to her classes as opportunity classes. Nothing negative, nothing bad, and wanted the students to be happy about being there. So if you want to hear more about Hattie, like I said, we have tours and things at the Philip Brown House. Like I said, this is going to be a shameless plug for different stories, but it's kind of what we do all day long, so always interesting. One of the things that I do find fascinating is that she was not only significant to us here in White Bear or her work with special education, but for several years she traveled, and we know very specifically in 1950 she went to New York to attend a national convention on special education as the Minnesota delegate. So it was certainly a movement that was happening, but she had been doing this since the 1920s. So again, ahead of her time. When she did retire from the classroom, specifically from the classroom, she went on to actually tutor, and she was part of what they referred to as the homebound program. And really, that could mean many, many things for students. If you broke your leg in the 60s and 70s, you were typically considered homebound. I mean, they didn't have necessarily elevators or other means of access to classrooms and whatnot. So you would have to stay home and you would miss out, and often you'd have to repeat a grade or repeat a semester or whatever. And so Hattie was concerned about that and wanted to make sure that students were able to continue their educations, even if that happened, or stay on track. And she did that until she was 77 years old, if you can envision. So this is one of my favorite stories for a lot of reasons, but if any of you were at the parade or watched the parade on cable or whatever, Bud Nakasone, who is on the left there, was our Grand Marshal this year. Edwin is his given name. Bud is what he prefers to be called. Bud was born in Hawaii. He was the son of Japanese immigrants. He graduated from high school in 1945, so World War II was raging, and was drafted into the Army at the very end of the war. But that wasn't actually his first encounter with World War II. When he was 14 years old, and it gives me chills when he tells the story, and you can Google him, there are YouTube videos and other things about it. But he has generously shared his story over the years. And he was a young boy of 14, sitting at the kitchen table eating his cornflakes, and he will very much make sure you get that piece of the specific description of the event. Eating his cornflakes when all of a sudden the Japanese planes came flying in over his house and bombed the barracks and bombed the airfield. And so he was literally in that moment, if you will. And then continued high school, went on, obviously impacted in many, many ways with his family and his neighbors and everyone else, and went on to be drafted right out of high school. And he was sent to, because he was Japanese American, he was sent to the military language school at Fort Snelling, Camp Savage at Fort Snelling. And Bud embraced that. If you've ever had the opportunity to meet him, and I think based on the few of the nods we've had, lots of folks have. He lived in White Bear for decades, was a teacher, which you'll hear about in a minute, but he embraced that opportunity. And again, a lot about, it was challenging. It was hands down challenging. There was tremendous discrimination, particularly against Japanese Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, of course. And so instead of being bitter about that or letting that destroy who he was as a person, he was one of many who stepped up and actually helped the war effort and worked through many different processes. And for the Japanese Americans, they were named Nisei soldiers. They were Japanese and American heritage mixed. And what it really came down to was their language skills, communication skills, and their understanding of the culture is said by many to have shortened the war, certainly by months, and often thought by years, just based on it. And they were able to communicate and encourage different units to surrender and do different things that, because they did it from a place where they understood some of the emotions and things that might have been happening. Bud he went on, I guess, after the military and attended the University of Hawaii and came out as a commissioned officer from the University of Hawaii, went through ROTC, and he ended up coming back to Minnesota because he liked it so well and he thought the people were so nice. So, yay us, I guess. But he and his wife Mary lived in White Bear Lake for decades. They had two sons, John and Paul, who you see here. I always point out that this is not necessarily Bud's accomplishment, but for many who know, Paul Nakasone was actually, he is a four-star general, retired four-star general from the Army, and he was the head of the NSA for a number of years in Cyber Command as well. Bud is very proud of that, and he likes to point that out, even though I said, you didn't actually do that. But it's all good. He's very happy. But and then Bud himself actually retired from the Army Reserves as a colonel, so no slouching there either. But what I love even more about him, additionally about him, I guess, is that he went on to, with his degree, he went on to become an educator. He was a teacher, and he taught 11th grade. At that time, American history in the White Bear schools was taught in 11th grade. And he taught 11th grade history in White Bear Lake from 1956 to 1970. And then Lakewood, as Century was called at the time, caught on to what a treasure he was locally, and he started teaching a few classes over there, and eventually they pulled him away from the high school and said, we need you over here. So from 1970 to 1999, he taught history at Lakewood. So if you do the math on that, it's over 40 years of teaching history in schools, public schools. In addition to that, you can see, so the picture on the right is actually Bud talking about some of his military background and the language schools at the Stearns History Center up in St. Cloud. On the left, he would actually, for his classes, he would dress as a Japanese fighter pilot and do a whole demonstration of their perspective on the war and how they were a piece of that, and where they were coming from and why they were able to help students understand how Pearl Harbor, for example, happened and how the war happened in general, and then would shift into the American perspective in his presentations. There are some versions of that online as well. He is now 98, so he is no longer doing that because he was very physical with it and very ambitious. But this is not actually all of his family, but from those two sons, he has many grandchildren and great-grandchildren now who were in the parade with him, handing out candy and doing stuff. But some of them weren't quite there yet, and the parade needed to start moving. So we wanted to take a picture and get the folks who were actually able to be there. He is also very proud that both of his sons, John and Paul, are White Bear High School graduates as well. So, in addition to actively teaching for many, and as if that wasn't enough, when he retired in 1999 from teaching every day in the classroom, he would go out on 2-month stints at a time on Navy ships and teach history to the sailors, believe it or not. So I love the fact that not only did he live history, did he make history, but then he would go on and share it in many ways. He has done countless interviews, oral history interviews, recordings, things to share his stories. He's donated photographs from Camp Savage and other things to different repositories. And he's written or edited a couple of books on either interviews with other Nisei soldiers and himself, and also essays. There's a book called The Nisei Soldier, which is a series of essays from that perspective as well. So, and those mostly are out of print, but I'm trying to see if we can get a few more at the Armory as well for that. But you can find them out there on eBay in different places. So we do have, there was a play called Secret Warriors a few months ago at the History Theater about the language schools and, about the language schools in general. And Bud actually was featured up here, you can see, and there's a couple other photographs of him in the display itself. We are fortunate that that run has ended, and so we were able to get those materials on loan. So they are on display at the Armory. So if people want to check that out, please come on by. We're open the rest of the week, basically, during the day for sure, and have lots of other hours that we can make that happen. So, and then we have Jerry Spees, who's been much talked about lately for a number of reasons, but also in the parade, if you saw the parade, we have, we'll see a picture of it in a minute anyway, but the Yankee Girl 2, which is a replica of the Yankee Girl. And Jerry Spees, in the 1970s, Jerry and his wife Sally were living on Floral Drive on the south end of town in a regular, one of those houses probably that was built in that picture that I showed when the developments were going in. Jerry was a veteran and was finishing his coursework at the University of Minnesota. And then went on to student teach at Mariner High School, so another teacher Apparently I'm inspired by teachers. I didn't catch that theme until now. But today, of course, Mariner is Mariner Middle School. But interestingly, little did the community at the time realize that Jerry had really big plans for a very small boat. The Yankee Girl, which he built himself in his garage and driveway, was made essentially of plywood and 2x4s. And then he fiberglassed it himself, painted her himself, all of it, and rigged it and all of that. Of course, he designed it as well. And because there is no, at that time especially, there was no other boat like this. His goal was to sail solo across the Atlantic Ocean in the world's smallest boat to do so, if that makes any sense. Which, if you see the boat, it really doesn't make any sense. But that was one of his dreams, and that's awesome. So the boat was 10 feet long. That's it, from the beginning to the end. And the beam, the widest point across, is 5 feet 6 inches, if you can imagine. And of course, that doesn't leave a whole lot of room, as you can guess. But he did manage to do his route. So this is from Norfolk, Virginia, across the ocean, across the Atlantic, to Falmouth, England, which took him 53 days and 5 hours, all by himself, being tossed around in the storms of the North Atlantic. What amazes me, probably more than that, honestly, is the fact that he did that in the summer of 1979. He got back here and did his whole thing. And if you can't get enough of the Jerry Speece story, we do have his book called Alone Against the Atlantic available. But he then decided, and it's hilarious, he recorded audio tapes all the way through, like through the planning process and all the way through the whole thing, and on the journey. And as he's starting off from Virginia, he's saying things like, "Oh, this is great, and I have so many ideas, and I want to do so many of these journeys, and I want to when I'm done with this, I want to go across the Atlantic in a kayak, and I want to do it in a canoe and on a raft, and I want to do the Pacific, and I want to go around the world," and all of these things. About 2 weeks in, because remember it took 53 days, about 2 weeks in, he's saying, "I'm not doing any of that. Can they just get me out of here?" It was rough. The first week or two were really rough. It did improve as time went on a little bit, but 2 years later, in 1981, he took off from California and did go. He went, but he broke it up, thankfully, for probably a lot of reasons. But he went from California to Hawaii, and then on down, and you can see his journey. He ended up in Australia. It took him about 5 months, but he did it. And then he stopped. And apparently, I've had the pleasure to meet his wife, Sally, his widow, Sally. Jerry passed away in 2019. But before I met her, one of the stories I had always heard was that from a friend of his who is a pilot up at Benson Airport and had taught Jerry how to fly, was that when he came home and said, "Okay, I've got my license," she said, "You are not flying around the world. We're done." That's not happening. So, and probably fair if she, had all of that going on. But he got incredible recognition, as you can imagine, for this. When he took off across the Atlantic, he didn't really tell a lot of folks what was going on. He wasn't totally sure he was going to make it. I mean, it was a wild idea. And people got wind of it as he continued on, and they knew he would succeed. And so Jason Davis from Channel 5, former reporter from Channel 5 KSTP, used to do the On the Road Again segments. He actually talked the Hubbard family, who owns Hubbard Broadcasting, owns the station, into sending him over there to record Jerry's arrival in England, so there isn't a lot of coverage of the process, there's lots of audio, but there's not a lot of film or that sort of thing. He had a few people take pictures as he left Norfolk, but not a lot. And so off he went, but they do have good footage of when he arrived. And then, because it was such a popular thing, when he did the Pacific, Jason Davis got to essentially follow him and record the whole thing. So there's wonderful footage of all of that process as he went. But when I say it wasn't a big boat, this is how he had to live for months at a time. And it's hard to envision. He made it big enough where he's sitting is supposed to be, there's supposed to be a berth and he's supposed to be able to go flat and sleep. He didn't very often because what he discovered very quickly was a couple of things, but one of which, when you're in the boat and the weather's bad or it's stormy and you're bouncing around like crazy, you can't lie down. I mean, you'd roll off, you'd hit, you'd be tossed around. So he actually, most of the time when he tried to sleep, he would brace his feet over here and his back on the other side, because it was only 5 feet or so across, and then there was lots of stuff in between. And the hatch would be closed usually because the waves would crash over the top and he'd get wet. And he would attempt to sleep, and of course, that didn't make for great sleep, which was quite a challenge. But he made it, and again, chose to do it again, which I think is the craziest part. This is his wife, Sally, on the left, and of course, President Jimmy Carter. It's entertaining. This is one of his prized photos. There's a lot of photos, as you can imagine, when he got back, and there were a lot of proclamations and awards and recognition and interviews, of course, public speaking engagements and all sorts of things. And but one of the things that I think is funny, that he was very excited, and we have a lot of his archives or a lot of his records at the Armory at the Historical Society. But one of the things that he talks about as he's leaving is, I never did get the letter I requested from President Carter when he headed out. So I'm guessing, knowing Jerry, he probably gave him a little grief about that when they did finally meet. But the Yankee Girl 2, as I mentioned, was in the parade the other night. It is a 95% exact replica of the original Yankee Girl. The Yankee Girl itself is at the Minnesota Historical Society, and we had tried to work out an agreement where we could have it on loan at the Armory. We wanted, the Spies story is one of the 10 stories that we have in our new exhibit called X Marks the Spot, which talks about 10 different history that happened around the lake, because the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society represents the communities of Birchwood, Delwood, Matamidi, White Bear Lake, and White Bear Township, the municipalities that touch the lake shore itself. And so Spies was one of those stories, and we wanted to try to get the Yankee Girl, which didn't quite work out for a lot of reasons. There are an incredible number of rules, as you can imagine, and I respect that. But as we worked through the process, it was kind of interesting, because all of a sudden it became very clear that we really just needed to make our own, so that people could interact with it and see it and touch it, none of which would have been allowed with the real one. And so this is, like I say, it's very close to the real one. This is, the transom is much larger, so that people are allowed, once it gets to the Armory, which it will after it's done on its little world tour, as we call it, people can stand in it or sit in it, get inside of it and feel, because that's the most shocking thing. If you have saw it at the boat show or saw it in the parade, and we're able to get somewhat close to it, that's what's really apparent, I guess. When you get near it, you can hear that it was a 10-foot boat, but when you think about the fact that this row of chairs is longer than 10 feet, it doesn't, until you really, truly see it, it doesn't click. And then when you envision, and in the back of his book, he lists all the provisions he took, and the 48 cans of Dinty Moore stew, and the 30-gallon jugs of water, and he had a footwell. We have it flat across the bottom just to make it easier for kids, but he did have a footwell in the boat. He never got to use it because he had gas cans piled through it, and so his feet were always propped up on the gas cans. So, he couldn't even sit normally, if you can envision that. And again, then he chose to do it again. That's the part that never fails to intrigue me. But so she's been in the parade and at the boat show. She will be, we are rededicating, the City of White Bear Lake and the Historical Society have worked together to rededicate the monument, the plaque that is down at Spies Landing, so by the bridge at Mataska Park. It was dedicated in 1979, named Spies Landing in 1979, just weeks after he got back from his first trip. And it had fallen apart. It was in bad shape for years. And so we've been able to work with the Spies family and with the city and get it redone, rebuilt, and hopefully last much, much longer. But she will be down there for that little unveiling ceremony tomorrow night from 5 to 6. And then Thursday night, like I said, Market Fest, we'll see what happens with the weather, but Thursday night, if the weather is decent, she will be on 4th Street for Market Fest for History Night. And then after that, this weekend, she'll be coming into the Armory and will be on display in the Armory. So we won't have to worry about the weather from that standpoint, but it'll be fun to see. But, so one of the things that like I said, I struggled with this presentation when I mean, the theme is very broad, the topic is very broad, and I feel strongly that if you've talked to me ever about history, you've probably heard me say that, you know, we're all part of history. We are making history every day. Yesterday is history, today is history, or will be very soon. And so these really extraordinary folks who have done wild things and very notable things absolutely are important and a significant part of our community. But every single person sitting here and every one of us is part of that. And so all together, we make the community what it is. And so what we are working on, and I'll end in a moment here with a quote from the Jerry's book, actually. But what we are working on, and this is just a concept picture right now, it won't look exactly like this, so bear with me. I know Dan is much better at art than I am, but it's the idea. We are working on a picture collage, essentially, of our community and putting photos in here of all of the pieces of our community. Anyone who can submit a photo, or anyone can submit a photo with the QR code, and we have some other vehicles to do it. But and the idea is, essentially, it's very simple. Tell us who you are. How are you making history? And if you don't feel like maybe you have yet, how do you want to make history? What do you want your legacy to be? Or what do you want your story to be? And of course, we are all many, many stories. But and the goal is to then have it form into a mosaic that forms a picture of a bear that we will have at the Armory long term. But we are very excited about that. And that's one of the things that I love about my role at the Historical Society, is that there's never a shortage of stories to tell, ever. We all have a story, and many, like I say, many, many stories. So whether you are like Hattie Long and maybe a little, a lot ahead of your time, or a little, you know, on a different path than some folks might feel is good or important or whatever, that story is valid too. And whether you are, you know, Jerry Speece, and there aren't a lot of Jerry Speaces, I will acknowledge that. But like I said, I'm going to end with a quote from Jerry that I really like, and it's a little bit long, but it kind of sums up that whole concept. He's at the end of his book, in the epilogue for the book, he said, "Many of us grow up with dreams we never realize. We don't take time to live them, or we let others discourage us. We listen to the choruses of why bother, and what will you gain from it, and never experience the joys of achieving goals we set for ourselves. I believe that everyone should have a dream and strive to reach it. People's dreams can be big or small, it doesn't matter. What matters is that a dream come true can change a person in some undefinable, vital way. And sometimes, and here's the best part, as he says, one dream will lead to another and another, until finally the act of dreaming becomes an endless cycle, a limitless horizon as vast as the sea itself." So with that, I'd like to leave you with that as inspiration. And please, it can be a selfie, it can be, you know, whatever. If you have concerns with technology, we'll help you do it. Whatever it is, but we are going to be collecting these throughout the summer, and then we'll be putting the mosaic together, and hopefully it'll be something that can be kept in our community for a long, long time. So thank you all for coming tonight, and if you have questions, feel free to ask.